World exploration, Chadley's involvement, and concerns for the Highwind in Remake Part 3. We've got some more interviews, this time with Tetsuya Nomura from the Rebirth Ultimania, where he talks about some of his concerns and also why they chose to do exploration the way they did in Rebirth. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe, and as always, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So as always, we are going to be sourcing this information of the Ultimania from the Shinra Archaeology Department on Twitter. Great folks over there, they do some great work. I highly recommend you guys follow them. And for this section in particular, we're focusing on some of the thoughts from Tetsuya Nomura, starting off first with the world map and some of the issues they wanted to overcome. The SAD writes, Rebirth creative director Nomura says they had two issues to overcome in developing the world map. The first was that they needed something that would motivate players to explore the world map, since just moving from destination to destination would feel meaningless. The solution to that came in the form of Hamaguchi's proposal that they center things around Chadley's world intel. The other issue was the problem of the airship. Nomura considers the airship in the third game to be the biggest obstacle in front of them now. So going back to that first part, whenever you're making an open world game, or in this case as Hamaguchi likes to call it open field, you can't just have a barren wasteland. You're gonna need to fill it out with activities and battles and different locations that the player can explore or even feel motivated to explore. Instead of it just being kind of very simple, like, okay, we're out in this open world, there's not too much to do, but I need to get from point A to point B. And that's kind of how Final Fantasy 15 was to a degree. Now, this isn't really super spoilery, but if you're someone who is playing through Final Fantasy 15 right now and you just kind of want to explore things as you go, this might be considered a spoiler, so you might want to skip this part of the video. But one of the biggest criticisms people had of Final Fantasy 15 was that you had this really big open world-ish kind of area to explore, but there wasn't a whole lot to do. There were some gas stations and restaurants, a couple of towns, but it wasn't really what we come to know from Final Fantasy, where there's tons of towns and villages and caves and tons of activities. You could do some stuff, you could go fishing, you could drive around with the Chocobros, which I loved, and again, even though there's not a ton to do in the world of Final Fantasy 15, just driving around in the regalia with those characters, listening to music, on our way to our destination, that was incredible. I loved it. I thought it was amazing. And of course, there are the hunt battles in 15, which were a ton of fun. There are dungeons you can explore too. The dungeons themselves weren't too dramatically different from one another, but they still held some challenging boss fights and some cool rewards. But for the most part, a lot of people are like, I don't have anything to do in this world. So I think they wanted to avoid that. So they decided to go all in on the world intel. There's tons of points of interest in Rebirth. And I know what some people might be thinking, well, the original games were like that. You just go on the world map and you could just run from point A to point B and there wasn't really a ton to do. Yes and no. A, you could get away with that stuff back then because games weren't as big as they are now. So if you look at the world map of FF7, yeah, you leave Midgar, then you make a beeline to Calm, and then you go from Calm to the Chocobo Ranch. It starts off very linear. But there's still a ton of locations for you to visit, whether they're out in the open or if they're areas that you kind of have to go out of your way to find. That worked back then. These days, you gotta fill out these really massive worlds with stuff to do. And centering it all around Chadley in the world intel actually does make a lot of sense. Because one thing I've said about this remake trilogy is that the developers don't do things just to do things. They like to motivate everything, usually through the story. Combat is one of the biggest things. In Rebirth, the story is bonds. That's the focus of these characters, going on a journey, getting to know one another, building a strong relationship with each other. That's in the story, but it also finds its way into the combat. So by having Chadley be the one kind of guiding you around with this world intel, that makes sense because he is part of the story. He has his own personality. He's got his own character arc. He's also a character that is just very naturally inquisitive. He wants to get out in the world and explore and archive all of this stuff. And eventually, when you complete all of the exploration stuff in Rebirth, you learn why Chadley wanted you to gather all of this information. And it's because he's trying to preserve as much of this planet as they possibly can because they don't know what's going to happen to it. So doing all of the world intel, it's not just, okay, let's keep people busy and give them stuff to do. It's ingrained into the story, which I really appreciate. And for a character like Chadley, it is a very noble cause. And the thing that I appreciate is if I'm going to a tower, a Remnawave tower, and I'm activating it, I'm not just activating the tower just to see what else is on the map. If I go to a tower, or if I go to one of the Mako Life Springs, it's not just activating something and putting something on the map. You're getting the lore of the land, which is super cool. Like in Junon, I believe, when you're activating some of those towers, you get some backstory on what happened between Shinra and Junon in their war. When you go to a summon shrine, you get backstory on the summon and why they're located in the region they are and what kind of effect they have not only on the lands, but the people that live there. So there's story motivation for just about everything that you're doing, and it's not like most open world games where it's like, okay, just go there, do the thing because it's on the map. You're actually getting rewarded for this stuff, which I actually really appreciate. Now, one criticism some people do have of Rebirth is that it feels too checklisty, which we've covered in past videos, and I completely understand that. On some occasions when I'm playing this game, it's like, okay, I'm going to open my map, I'm going to go here, 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 and here. Part of me kind of likes that because I'm a bit OCD and I like to keep track of my stuff and know where I'm going and what I'm doing. But after a while, it does feel like a checklist, and a lot of people kind of miss the way it was in the older games where you just had a map and you explored. And the developers have already said in previous interviews after Rebirth has come out that for part 3, not only do they want more player freedom in combat, but they want more player freedom when it comes to exploration. And they want to have it the way it was in the original game, where you've got a map, but there are some things that you're going to have to discover on your own. There will be secrets and there will be things that you miss, which I love. Now, on the flip side of that, I have had people comment on the channel before saying that when they play games, they unfortunately don't have a ton of time to sit down and devote to those games. So they like having a map like they did in Rebirth, which tells them where everything is at and where they need to go. So hopefully in part 3, they can find some sort of happy medium with that map where there are some key points of interest that the game will want you to go to, but there's going to be a ton of stuff that you can just find on your own exploring. A Materia cave, Lucrezia's cave, or Lucretia, however you pronounce her name. Hidden enemies, Materia. I think it will be like it was in the OG game. Now, when it comes to Chadley, I know a lot of people out there don't like Chadley. They get annoyed with how much he talks, how much he wants you to do, how much he interacts with Cloud and the party. It becomes a lot. You're just minding your own business, you get the little ring, and then you hear, Cloud. It can be a lot. Personally, I didn't really have an issue with Chadley. I found him kind of endearing, especially after learning more about his character and also some of the weird deep stuff that's going on with him and Hojo. Clearly, Hojo still has some sort of grasp on Chadley and can actually affect him physically, which I think is going to probably lead into some really dark stuff in part 3. And it also might be a story reason for why we may not have towers in part 3. Shinra might have only expanded so far with those towers, and at some point they just decided, okay, the rest of that continent, we're just going to leave as is. We're not even going to bother venturing that far right now. So the regions we had in Rebirth had the towers, so it's a possibility that those other areas that we'll get in part 3 might potentially not have any towers. And if some dark, tragic stuff does end up happening to Chadley, we might not have anybody to guide us in part 3, which is where that player freedom comes into play, and it's really going to be up to the player on how we navigate things. I will say though, I had one moment where I lost my cool with Chadley. I didn't mean to do it. It just happened. I was in the Dust Bowl. I was doing some of the challenges. I was getting my butt whooped. So I decided to see Chadley to develop some materia. And he kind of egged me on a little bit because I hadn't completed some of the intel he was looking for. And I snapped a little bit and I said, Chadley, I don't have time for your shit right now, okay? My ass is getting rocked in the Dust Bowl and I need some help with it. Read the damn room. I will get to your intel at a later date. I'm not proud of that moment, but it happened, okay? I like to be honest on this channel. Now, addressing the second part of that tweet where Nomura talks about having the Highwind technically be the biggest obstacle in their path now, I think is 100% true. And we do have some more tweets that will cover that. But what I do want to say right now is that a lot of these Ultimania interviews are done pretty well in advance. Usually right as the game is getting ready to actually come out. So by now, they have most definitely figured out what to do with the Highwind. And I feel comfortable saying that because if we look at the Riyadh showcase that Hamaguchi and Katase did last year, they straight up teased the Highwind and some of the cool ideas that they want to implement with this actual airship. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Hamaguchi was not only just talking it up like crazy, but even Katase was like, yeah, I believe the words he used here was, what Hamaguchi and the team have come up with for the Highwind is mind-blowing. So again, Japanese developers don't normally talk like that. when it comes to their games and hyping them up. It's usually, please look forward to our game. We worked very hard. We hope you check it out. And you got Hamaguchi and Katase saying, yeah, we're going to make the best game ever. It's going to be incredible. Watch what we do with the Highwind. So clearly they've already figured that stuff out. But we continue with some of more Nomura's thoughts. He goes on to say, what concerns Nomura most is the logistics of it landing. In order to land a giant airship, you'd need a wide flat surface like a runway. But if they approach it like that, then the vehicle will have a lot less freedom in where it touches down. He says it used to be you could just land your little airship icon and things would be fine. But with the graphical scale now more realistic, that's no longer enough. Until that problem is resolved, he thinks flying around in an airship is going to be a real challenge. I 100% understand what he's saying here, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier in the video about how you need to fill out your world with things to do, because it's not like how it was in the original game where the map itself was big, but going from destination to destination wasn't extreme. And you look at Rebirth, it being an open field game, in part 3, which is most likely going to be a true open world game, you have all of these regions which are massive in size. They have to be bigger because things are much more realistic now. And that's the approach they wanted to take with the Remake trilogy in particular. I'm sure if they wanted to, they probably could have had a world map like they did in the old game, or even like how Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is doing. Their world map is very much old school like it was in Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, where you've got these kind of deformed characters running around this big world, but everything isn't to proper scale. It could have worked, but the direction they're going, I very much enjoy. Again, it's much more realistic, and it makes the world feel even bigger. But then again, when you have the Highwind, it's not like how it was in the original game where you could have a cloud on the world map who was the same size as the Highwind, who could then fly around and land everywhere. You now have to think about logistically, the Highwind, this massive, massive ship, and again, I stress it, this ship is massive, and we saw it a little bit in Rebirth. It's gigantic. It's unreal how big they made the Highwind. So now, as you're building your world, you have to think about, okay, we're gonna have to design regions for part 3 now that just organically accommodate the Highwind, so that way you can just land it anywhere. So some of these snowy zones, maybe the areas around Wutai and Rocket Town will be much bigger than the region we had in Rebirth, so that way they can just kind of from scratch make these zones much more accessible for this massive ship that we're going to be flying around. Which does make me wonder, what about the regions in Rebirth? They're big, but some of those regions, I don't think you're going to be able to land the Highwind like you would in the original game. Maybe in the grasslands you could do that, maybe in some sections of Cosmo Canyon you could do that, but this ship ain't landing in Gungaga. It just ain't happening. So in this instance, we go back to the example that Nomura gave of you don't want to just have highways and landing strips for the airship to land on, because that restricts your freedom. The whole point of the Highwind in the original game, and I'm assuming is the same point that they want to keep with the Remake trilogy, is that when you got that Highwind, you could go anywhere and do anything. You could land wherever the hell you wanted to. For the most part, there were some areas that only chocobos could access, but the whole point is that you had freedom. And if suddenly you don't have that freedom in the Remake trilogy, and if you have to land the Highwind, you have to go to some sort of airstrip to do so, that really restricts what you can do in terms of player freedom. And they're gonna wanna avoid that as much as possible. Now, how do you do that? Well, in previous videos we've done here on the channel, I like to do community comments where we get thoughts from you guys. We talked about the Highwind and how on earth do you figure out the Highwind? How do you land it? How do you fly it? And one suggestion that people had was just use a ladder. It sounds very simple, but you fly around in the Highwind, you want to exit the Highwind, but you can't land. You press a button, the characters show up on the deck of the Highwind, and then they can just slide down a ladder and start exploring the ground. That is probably the simplest way to do so. If there's not enough space to actually land the ship, just use a ladder. So that might be what they go with. But the developers in charge of this remake project, again, they genuinely do care. And I've seen so many cynical takes over the years of people saying that this remake trilogy is just a cash grab, it's soulless, they're just milking the franchise until it's dead. I vehemently disagree just because of what I've played and the interviews we've covered here on the channel. These developers know how important the original game was, and they're putting their heart and soul into what they're creating with this remake trilogy, and I think it really shows. So they know how how important certain elements of the original game are, and they're going to want to stay true to that stuff. And whatever it was that they came up with the Highwind, it's probably going to be incredible, and I cannot wait to see it, especially if they incorporate some airship battles, maybe some cool dogfights with Shinra ships. That could be sick. Now, you're probably wondering, part 3, it's going to have weapons, there's going to be the ocean floor. What does Nomura think about all of that stuff? Well, he's concerned. Nomura says, it's actually not just the airship. There are a lot of other things that they still have to figure out about the world map going to the third game. For instance, in the OG, weapons show up and roam around. He wonders how they're supposed to depict stuff like that. The interviewer says you've also got the parts where you go to the sea floor and outer space. Katase then says, yeah, honestly, what will we do for the sea floor stuff? They then all laugh. Again, man, there's going to be so much we're going to have to do in part 3. There's the airship travel, there's the new regions, but those weapons, we've talked ad nauseum about the weapons. How are we going to fight the weapons? What kind of cool combat stuff can we do? But we've never really talked about how do you actually incorporate those weapons into the world. For something like Ultimate Weapon, that should be relatively easy because in the original game, it just kind of flew around from region to region. So you could probably replicate that no problem. In part 3, you get into the airship, you run into it to initiate battle, and then from there, we don't know how battle and combat is actually going to happen in the air with that weapon. Diamond Weapon will probably be the easiest to figure out though, because it comes from the ocean, it makes its way to the land, and then you fight it on land. But you look at things like Ruby Weapon. When you're in Nibelheim, I believe there's a poster that talks about like this Grand Canyon type area. And if you look at the poster, it's basically Ruby Weapon built into a mountain. So it's in the ground, it's on the surface, it's pretty big, and it reaches pretty far. So again, I referenced Final Fantasy 15. Spoiler alert for those who have not played that game, but there's a really, really cool moment in Final Fantasy 15 where you've been driving around this world map for hours at this point, and suddenly this mountain that you've seen countless times over and over and over again wakes up. And it turns out that mountain was not a mountain. It was an adamantoise. So you now have to go and fight a literal mountain, which is super cool. Also very terrifying, and I think maybe you could do something kind of similar with Ruby Weapon, have it be built into the region, where it just suddenly either pops up from the ground, or maybe it's always been there, but it looks like a mountain, and then when it wakes up, it becomes its true Ruby Weapon self. And again, if these weapons are going to be big, then you're going to need a lot of space to fight them. So it would make sense that Ruby Weapon would take up a huge section of a region for you to fight. And if there's cliff sides somewhere, you could have party members split up, climb the cliffs, attack certain parts of the body. It could be pretty cool. Emerald Weapon might be the most difficult because again, it takes place in the ocean. On the ocean floor in particular. The easiest solution would be underwater materia. Maybe the underwater materia turns underwater combat into combat that you're doing on the ground on the surface. Or underwater combat could be just like how combat is on the surface, but when your characters are in the air. So characters like Cloud, Tifa, Yuffie, they can do air combat no problem. I don't know how they would accommodate people like Barrett and Red 13 who are normally on the ground. It might be a little difficult for them, but who knows? We've talked in the past too of how you could have it almost be kind of like Horizon Forbidden West, which again, that game is incredible. It's visually stunning. It's also on the Decima engine, which is a completely different engine, but it's an engine that is super powerful. But maybe you could kind of take a cue from that game, which Hamaguchi has been very open about. He loves games like Horizon, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Witcher, and they take a lot of inspiration from those games when it comes to their world design. But maybe you could have the characters actually dive into the ocean and explore certain areas and maybe even reach the ocean floor with the help of that underwater materia. And then once you're down on the floor, you're fighting Emerald Weapon, but it's still like combat is on the surface. So you're able to run around, use your regular abilities in combat, synergy stuff, and it would work just fine. So I think that might be what they do there. So again, the developers know what they're doing, and based on what I've played in Remake and Rebirth, I completely trust what they want to do with Part 3, and I'm sure they've probably already found ways to incorporate the weapons and figure out how to fight them in ways that are really cool, big, action set pieces, but are very unique as well. Because these are weapon battles that people have been waiting for a very, very long time. The weapons are such a huge part of the original FF7, at least here in America. If I remember correctly, Japan did not get the weapons. We got them here in North America first. But figuring out how to incorporate these battles we've all been waiting for, I'm sure they're hard at work. They've probably figured it out by now, and I really can't wait to see what they're going to do because, again, these are going to be massive, massive creatures. How do we fight these things? It could be pretty cool. But with that being said, that is the video. I normally include more tweets in these types of videos, but these were all kind of focused around exploration and world building, so I wanted to kind of keep these together in one video. But let me know in the comments down below, what are your thoughts on what we covered in today's video? How do you think they're going to handle stuff with the airship? And do you kind of agree with me in part 3 in the sense that we might possibly lose Chadley, which could lead to more open organic exploration and more spontaneity when it comes to actually running around the world map? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.